Hello everybody, I'm Brainy Diode, and I am back to talk about all the games I played for the first time in 2021. Full disclosure, this introduction is the last part of the script I'm writing because I have spent the better part of a month wondering how the heck I'm supposed to sum up 2021 and set up this video. I'll be honest with you guys, despite how much 2020 sucked, I honestly think 2021 was worse for me personally, which, you know, is a little sad to say out loud, but I played some video games, and some of them I enjoyed. I did a tier list for last year's equivalent of this video, but I decided to go back to a ranked list format this time, partially because I really enjoy making ranked lists for reasons I don't fully comprehend, and partially because if I did a tier list, then nearly a third of the entire list would be A tier, and that's just not very well balanced, now is it? Also, in previous years, I would try to make each game's entry roughly equivalent in length, except the number 1 game, but I'm playing fast and loose with this video, and sometimes I just don't have that much to say about a game. So if I don't have much to say about a game this year, I won't say much about it, and I won't make any effort to artificially lengthen the segment, and you all will just have to deal with it. Another note, I took a poll late last year asking if, when I discuss remasters/remakes with significant amounts of new content that applies to Nier Replicant version 1.22, Super Mario 3D World plus Bowser's Fury, and Xenoblade Chronicles Deathinitive Edition on this list. People wanted to see me rank the new content separately from the original game, or if they wanted me to rank them together. That ended with a tie between no, rank them together in all cases, and it depends on the game. So I've decided to rank Super Mario 3D World and Bowser's Fury separately, since they have such a different level design philosophy, but just briefly touch on the new content for both of the other two. With that all out of the way, let's get into this, I guess. Number 28. Sonic Adventure 2, Sega 2001. Sonic Adventure 2 is a 3D platformer in which you play as Sonic the Hedgehog and a variety of other characters on an adventure to discover the secrets of a military satellite taken over by Dr. Eggman. I feel like there's not much of a point to me reviewing this. It's old enough and famous enough that you probably already know if you're interested in playing it. Ever since I played Sonic Generations back in 2019, I've been searching for another game that will give me that same feeling, and Adventure 2 was certainly not it. The early stages were decent, with the exception of Tails and Eggman stages, which I personally found pretty boring throughout, but by the end, the speed stages were demanding a level of precision the controls just didn't allow for, and the treasure hunter stages were becoming overly large and obnoxious to navigate. And then there was that one Rouge stage, you know the one. If I went back and played some of the earlier levels again, I might be kinder to this game, but I distinctly remember coming off the end of the game with a very sour taste in my mouth, and feeling that it was one of the least enjoyable video game experiences I've had in a long time. Also, when you pick continue on the main menu, why do you get a dialogue box that says warning with just a button that says okay? What? What are you warning me about? Number 27, Superland, Supra Games 2018. Superland is a puzzle adventure game taking place in a literal child's sandbox that sees you playing as a citizen of the Red Kingdom on a quest to recover the water stolen by the Blue Kingdom. I had often heard this game touted as a fun indie alternative to Zelda, but quite frankly, I have to disagree. The puzzle elements were fine, if a bit obtuse at times, but I found it pretty lacking in almost every other regard. The movement controls and the first-person perspective make platforming more of a challenge than it should be. There is very little incentive for exploration, and combat happens far too often for how shallow it is. It's the combat that was really the biggest point against the game for me. There's a specific move in combat that is pretty satisfying to pull off the first few times, but very quickly after you unlock it, it becomes basically the only viable option in combat. It's a move with one of the guns in the game and requires fairly precise aiming, something I've always been bad at to begin with, but that's exacerbated by the fact that enemies tend to move around fairly quickly. They also make far too little noise for a first-person game, often resulting in me being damaged by an enemy right behind me that I had no idea was there. To avoid those kinds of situations, I wound up strafing around the battlefield quite a bit in every combat encounter, but then I kept running into level geometry that I didn't see because I couldn't afford to look where I was going, and all of this added up to make precise aiming almost impossible. The only melee option is the sword, which puts you close enough to enemies to be in serious danger, and does very little damage compared to the gun anyway. I hate to get on a game's case this much for one aspect that it does badly, especially when that one aspect doesn't even seem to be the primary focus, but combat encounters were so consistent and lasted so long that they soured almost my entire experience. I was ready to be done about 5 hours before the game was, and when a game is only 10 hours long, that's never a position you want to be in. Number 26, Inner Space, Polyknight 2018. Inner Space is an adventure flight simulator in which you play as a living plane helping a living ship with an archaeological investigation. If I were giving out named awards, this game would have to win Most Forgettable. It's got a few interesting ideas, but they're all wrapped up in a package that I found frankly pretty boring. Exploring a world on the inside of a spheroid is a cool concept, but figuring out how I was oriented was so difficult, and landmarks are so similar to each other, that I had far too tough a time figuring out where I had been and where I needed to go. I didn't feel particularly interested in exploring anyway, because most of the rewards were either a gameplay sequence of chasing after another flying creature through tight spaces with controls I never fully got a hold of, or exposition on the central mystery, which I found neither compelling in its setup nor satisfying in its conclusion. At least it looked nice. That's not nothing. Number 25. Darksiders II Deathinitive Edition, Nordic Games 2018, Remaster of Darksiders II, Vigil Games 2012. Darksiders II Deathinitive Edition is an action-adventure game in which you play as Death of the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, doing the exact opposite of what his name implies by bringing the human race back from extinction. Last year, I praised the remaster of the first game for being a fun alternative to pre-Breath of the Wild Zelda that may not have quite measured up to Zelda in terms of level design, story, or atmosphere, but made up for it with interesting dungeon theming and a more in-depth combat system that incorporated a lot of the dungeon items, giving them expanded use outside of the dungeons they were introduced in. The sequel clearly tried to iterate on the first game, with a grander story, bigger overworld environments, movement that feels just a little bit better, and a new loot system for upgrading your gear, but it feels like a step down in almost every other area. Gone is the interesting post-apocalyptic level theming. Now most of the game takes place in a generic fantasy world. Gone are the combat uses for most of the dungeon items. Hope you like melee combat with a main weapon and a sub-weapon and a ranged option which is effectively useless in combat by the end of the game. There are nearly 3 times as many dungeons in this game as there were in the first, and so few of them were satisfying or memorable to me. The story was clearly making an effort to feel much grander in scope than the first games, but completely failed to engage me. My advice is, if you want to check this series out, stick to the first game. Number 24, Lifeless Planet, Stage 2 Studios, 2014. Lifeless Planet is an adventure platformer in which you play as the first astronaut to land on a planet hosting alien life, only to discover an abandoned Soviet town and no other sign of any kind of life. That central mystery sounds really cool, but it has one of the most underwhelming payoffs I've ever seen, and the platforming feels really bad as well. Also, why is New Game an option in the pause menu? Furthermore, why is New Game the default option in the pause menu? Number 23, Stella, Skybox Labs 2019. Stella is a 2D adventure platformer in which you play as a woman attempting to survive the end of the world. I've yet to actually play Limbo, Inside, or Little Nightmares, but from what I know about those games, I'm fairly certain they have a pretty large influence on this one. Unfortunately, this game feels like a studio trying to emulate a genre of game they like without really understanding why it works. A vague plot that leaves a lot up to audience interpretation absolutely can work, but if it's going to, it needs to feel like the authors had their own interpretation as well. I need to be able to tell that there was a coherent plan that I'm just not being let all the way in on, but I really don't get that sense at all from Stella. This story just feels like a collection of generic horror tropes strung together by a vague implication that they're associated in some nebulous way that no one, the developers included, is quite sure of. At least it looks really nice. Number 22, Hugh Fiddlesticks 2016. Hugh is a 2D puzzle platformer in which you play as a boy named Hugh searching for his missing mother. It's got a really unique and cool central mechanic involving changing the color of the background to cause parts of each puzzle room to appear and disappear. If you're a big fan of puzzle games, this one is definitely worth checking out. It just didn't align with my personal tastes particularly well. Number 21, The Legend of Zelda, Nintendo 1986. That's right, it's the original. The Legend of Zelda, if you somehow don't know, is an adventure game that sees you play as the hero Link on a quest to reassemble the Triforce of Wisdom to defeat the evil beast Ganon. I apologize for the still image on this entry. I played this on the Legend of Zelda Game & Watch that released last year, which I can't exactly capture footage from. This does also mean that you can probably expect segments on one or both of Zelda 2 and Link's Awakening next year. I'll keep this segment short, since most of you probably know all you care to know about this game already. On its own, it's a decently entertaining game with a lot of, shall we say, archaic aspects, but getting to experience this piece of gaming history was really awesome. Definitely use a walkthrough if you intend to play it yourself, though. As for the Game & Watch system itself, if you're just interested in the games, there's definitely better ways to experience all three of them, but it does make for a pretty cool collector's item, I think. I own a Game & Watch now, and that alone is enough for me, at least, to justify the purchase to myself. Number 20, The Room, Nintendo Switch, Fireproof Games 2018, remaster of The Room, Fireproof Games 2012. The Room is a 3D puzzle game that has absolutely nothing to do with the movie, and sees you opening a series of puzzle boxes in an attempt to solve an alchemical mystery. It looks really good for a mobile game remaster, and it does a decent job of emulating escape room-style experiences. While it lacks a lot of the tactile satisfaction of actual escape rooms, and I'll probably always prefer those kinds of experiences with friends, this is a pretty solid alternative if you're on a budget — this game is really inexpensive — or are worried about the pandemic. Just like Hugh, this didn't align with my own tastes, but if you like puzzle games, this is definitely worth giving a shot. Number 19. Team Sonic Racing, Sumo Digital 2019. I want to make a quick note right away. The video capture on screen right now does seem to show some pretty bad performance issues, and I want to assure you that that's just a result of the recording. When I wasn't recording, the game ran just fine. Team Sonic Racing is a kart racer starring the cast of Sonic the Hedgehog franchise that implements a co-op system in a way I've not seen in a kart racer before. As a single-player experience, I think it's just a bit weaker than Sonic and All-Stars Racing Transformed, which I reviewed last year, mostly because there are fewer tracks, and the ones that are here aren't quite as fun or memorable as some of my standout favorites from Racing Transformed. However, based on what I've picked up from other reviews and from my own experience with the game, this game shines the brightest in the 3-player couch co-op. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to talk my friends into trying that aspect of the game out yet, but if I do, I'll definitely come back and give it the review it deserves. Number 18, Catherine Classic, Atlas 2019, port of Catherine, Atlas 2011. Catherine Classic is a puzzle game slash social sim in which you play as a man named Vincent who is having trouble deciding if he wants to propose to his girlfriend. Their relationship is further complicated when a new girl enters the picture, and Vincent apparently starts cheating on his girlfriend with her, but he can't remember any of the time he spends with her. Meanwhile, he has bizarre nightmares in which he must solve puzzles to climb a mysterious tower. As you might be able to guess, the game is split into two parts, a puzzle game based around Vincent's nightmares, and a social sim based around Vincent's attempts to get his waking life back in order. The puzzle phases were a lot of fun at the beginning, but by the end, their increased difficulty, combined with the ever-tightening time limit, started to frustrate me some. I just think timers and puzzles don't tend to mix particularly well, but just like with some other games on this list, if you're more of a puzzle game fan than me, you'll probably enjoy this one more than me. The social sim aspect, on the other hand, feels very underbaked. You're able to listen to the backstories of the side characters that feed into the main plot a little bit, and occasionally you'll be given questions that affect a morality meter you have that determines which ending you'll get, but that's about it. Other than those questions, the only thing that seems to be affected by who you talk to and when is whose backstory you get more or less of. I'm not usually a fan of black and white morality systems in general because I feel like they often make it way too easy to fall into the trap I did of saying what I thought the game wanted me to say, rather than answering how I actually believe. Also, a few of the questions have completely unpredictable impacts on the morality meter, like picking a favorite sport. There are decent parts of both sides of this game, but I think it would have been a bit better served by committing to one side or the other. Number 17, The Talos Principle, Croteam 2014. The Talos Principle is a puzzle game in which you play as an android collecting sigils so you can earn the right to live in peace with your creator for eternity. At risk of sounding like a broken record, this is a very solid puzzle game that people who like the genre more than me will probably enjoy quite a bit. The story, although it didn't affect me as much as it did some other people, was pretty interesting as well. A word of warning though, if you want the ending for getting all the stars, use a guide. I could have played this game every day for years and still not have figured out some of those puzzles, and frankly, that was probably my least favorite of the three endings anyway. Number 16, Anodyne 2, Return to Dust. Analgesic Productions, 2019. Anodyne 2 Return to Dust is an adventure game harkening back to the very early days of 3D gaming that sees you play as Nova, a being created to rid the world of the destructive substance known as dust. You explore a 3D overworld where you can meet different NPCs and discover collectibles, and then you shrink down to go inside certain NPCs and complete 2D top-down dungeons to cleanse them of dust infections. I feel like, similar to last year's Naissance, this is my really weird indie game of the year. Obviously, you don't get a ton of games that look like this anymore, especially not ones that mix 2D and 3D the way this one does. And the story also goes a bit off the rails near the end. Oh, and then there's Desert NPC. I won't spoil what happens with Desert NPC, but if you've played this game, you know exactly what I'm talking about. The dungeons here are pretty well designed, but it's with the overworld that most of my problems lie. Frankly, I think it looks pretty ugly, not because I don't like the visual style at all, but because I don't care for most of the environmental textures or the general color palette. Also, the sound design has an unfortunate tendency to make me feel uneasy at times when I'm really not convinced that was the intent. Additionally, as someone who really only started getting into gaming with the Wii, I just don't have a lot of nostalgia for this era of games, so I'm obviously not the target audience. Still, I do think that there's enough good in this game for it to be worth giving a try. Number 15, New Super Lucky's Tale, Playful Corp 2019. Remaster of Super Lucky's Tale, Playful Corp 2017. New Super Lucky's Tale is a 3D platformer in which you play as a fox named Lucky as he treks through a variety of fantasy worlds on a quest to defeat an evil sorcerer and rescue his sister. I'll be honest, this feels like a pretty by-the-numbers 3D platformer. I'll admit, I'm not the most experienced with the genre. I've played most of the 3D Marios, a couple 3D Sonics, A Hat in Time, and the Spyro Reignited trilogy, and that's about it. And this game looks, sounds, and feels about as nice as you can expect out of any of those. And the exploration and collecting is fun and satisfying to a point, but I really feel like the level design wasn't really quite up to the standards many of those other games had set for me, and it seemed to be lacking some aspect of their charm as well, though it's clearly trying very hard to match their charm. To my understanding, one of the main differences between this remaster and the original Super Lucky's Tale is that the DLC world from the original is packed into the base game this time, and that was definitely my favorite world of the bunch, so having never actually played the original, I do recommend this version over it. All in all, for reasons I unfortunately can't quite put a finger on, this game failed to make a particularly big impression on me. If you're starving for a new 3D platformer, you can certainly do worse than this, but unfortunately I doubt Lucky is going to be going head-to-head with Mario anytime soon. Oh, but if you do play it, definitely use a controller with rumble. I played the Switch version, and the rumble from the Joy-Cons made Lucky's burrowing so much more satisfying than it probably would have been otherwise. Number 14, Raji, an Ancient Epic. Notting Head Games 2020. Raji, an Ancient Epic, is an action-adventure game based on Hindu folklore in which you play as a young woman named Raji on a quest to save her brother from a demon army. To reference a much more famous game, which will be making an appearance of its own shortly, Raji basically does for Hinduism what Okami does for Japanese mythology. Unfortunately, I'm not as familiar with the culture as I would like to be, so what I have to say about how this game adapts it will be pretty vague. Sorry about that. The art style is just as striking and beautiful as Okami's, but in a completely different way, and from what I understand, the 3 weapons in the game are ones famously wielded by Hindu deities. On the subject of weapons, the combat is surprisingly deep, and stays pretty satisfying for most of the game, although you do get a weapon close to the end that completely trivializes most encounters. Unfortunately though, that's about where my praises will end. The platforming and exploration leave a lot to be desired. The platforming controls simply don't feel very good, to the point where I died multiple times on the second jump. And there's very little off the beaten path to actually find as far as I could tell. Also, calling anything in this game a puzzle would be pretty generous. The biggest shame though is that the integration of the cultural influence was much weaker than in Okami. A lot of it is just optional retellings of what I assume are popular Hindu myths narrated to the player while you look at some diegetic murals. The murals are nice, don't get me wrong, but these segments really harm the pacing, and for the most part don't seem to actually connect to the main plot of the game. The game also seems to expect that you come in with a degree of familiarity with the source material that I simply didn't have, which really makes me wonder for whose benefit they were included. Maybe I'll have to return to this at some point when I know a little bit more about the culture. There's enough good here that if the concept of Okami for Hinduism is intriguing to you, I'd still recommend giving it a shot, but not enough that I'd call it a must-play if not. The ending does seem to imply the intent for a sequel, so if this team can manage to iron out some of the wrinkles in a potential Raji 2, I'll happily be there to give it another shot. Number 13, Mario Party Superstars, ND Cube 2021. What can I say? It's Mario Party. You probably already know if you want to play it or not, so I won't bother giving a recommendation for or against it. But for my part, it's a fun little excuse to sit down with a group of friends and yell about stupid stuff for a while, and sometimes that's exactly what I need. Number 12. Sayonara Wild Hearts, Sumogo 2019. Sayonara Wild Hearts is an arcade-like about a woman transported to an alternate universe to defeat the evil Arcana and its 4 minions who threw the world into chaos. It describes itself as a pop album video game, and belongs to the same category of games as Wandersong that I'd like to see more of. A category that I have yet to come up with a better name for than games that are about music but aren't rhythm games. On paper, there's actually very little about this game that I should like. It's very short. I finished the main campaign in about 2.5 hours. There isn't very much mechanical depth. I don't tend to care for pop music very much, and there's a lot of tarot card symbolism here, and those who know me in real life will know that I don't make much of an effort to keep my distaste for mysticism to myself. Nevertheless, when I first saw the launch trailer about 1.5 years ago, I was transfixed. I've probably watched that dang trailer more than any other game trailer out there. And now that I've actually played the game, I'm happy to report that I had a great time. A lot of that probably has to do with the circumstances under which I played it. Specifically, I got the Switch version and played it during a family vacation in which a 2 or 3 hour car ride would happen at least once every other day. This is an ideal game for travel, with individual levels never lasting more than 4 or 5 minutes, and plenty of incentive to go back and replay them over and over to improve your score. And the lack of mechanical depth makes it easy to pick up and put down without needing to worry too much about getting rusty in between play sessions. Usually, I'm one to complain about something prioritizing style over substance, but when a game like this comes along where the style so obviously is the substance, it's a lot easier to forgive. My recommendation for this one is go watch the launch trailer, and if it looks like something you would enjoy, give it a try. That seems obvious, but I absolutely would never have given this game a shot if I had just heard it described, rather than seeing the trailer for myself. So it's well worth your time to give it that much attention, at least. Number 11. Okami HD, Capcom 2012. Remaster of Okami, Clover Studios 2006. Okami HD is an action-adventure game in which you play as the sun goddess Amaterasu in the form of a white wolf on a journey to defeat the 8-headed serpent Orochi. Let's get this game's most obvious feature out of the way. It looks gorgeous. It adapts the style of those classic Japanese paintings into explorable 3D environments wonderfully, and we get to see paintings of that style in the introductions to enemies and major NPCs. And the art style isn't the only cue it takes from Japanese history. Speaking as someone who ultimately isn't all that familiar with the culture, this feels like Japanese mythology, the video game. I understand that some liberties were taken in adapting various pieces of folklore, but it's nice as an American to see a piece of pop culture take so much inspiration from a culture that isn't European. Several of the higher-ups from Clover Studios went on to be involved in Platinum Games after Clover's closure, and you can definitely see some of those trademark character action aspects in Okami. Combining that with a Zelda-like adventure game is not something you see a ton of, so this game is certainly unique in a lot of ways. Unfortunately, the gameplay feels rather lackluster both as a character action game and a Zelda-like. The combat lacks a lot of the depth I expect from the genre, and there are plenty of cool dungeon puzzle solving mechanics, but just not enough solid dungeon puzzles for them to feel like they reach their full potential. I know very little about the sequel Okami Den, so I can't comment on whether or not it improved on the framework this game sets up, but I'd love to see Platinum or Capcom return to something like this in the future, because this feels like the foundation of something truly wonderful. Number 10. Super Mario 3D World, Nintendo Switch. Nintendo 2021. Remaster of Super Mario 3D World, Nintendo 2013. Super Mario 3D World is a 3D platformer in which you play as Mario, Luigi, Peach, or Toad on an adventure to save the Sprixie Kingdom from Bowser. Now, there's a pretty high baseline of fun you can have with a 3D Mario game, but now having played every 3D Mario except for 3D Land on the 3DS, yes, I've even played Super Mario 64 DS, this is one of the weaker ones in my opinion. I maintain that stages being set up like a 3D version of 2D Mario games is an interesting gimmick, but not one that can give it quite the level of distinctiveness that my favorite 3D Marios, Galaxy and Odyssey, could achieve. I feel like it's much more suited to being supplemental to the Switch's Big New Mario game than being the Big New Mario game itself like it was on the Wii U. That all said, this is certainly some of the tightest level design the series has ever seen, so if you're a fan of 3D platforming, you really owe it to yourself to give this a shot, especially because of the Bowser's Fury mode the Switch version of the game comes packaged with, which I will be talking about in a moment. Of course, this game's other big gimmick is that the entire campaign can be played in local and now online co-op. I'm not big on online gaming, and I haven't managed to wrangle a group of friends into playing this one with me quite yet, so I can't comment on that side of the experience, but I'm sure it'll be a lot of fun when I do. Number 9. Bowser's Fury, Nintendo 2021. This is the one time in this video that I've decided to talk about a game's new content separately from the base game, just because of how different the design philosophy of Bowser's Fury is from 3D World. This one is a lot more open-ended, with mini-platforming challenges on islands scattered throughout a big lake you can easily navigate on Plessie's back. They do a pretty good job of reusing the same areas for multiple challenges, and the non-linear structure gives you a lot of freedom to avoid challenges you don't like. One of the biggest switch-ups, though, is the inclusion of Fury Bowser. Every once in a while, Bowser will awaken, add some new level geometry in the form of big ol' spikes he drops on the terrain, and start firing lasers at you. I'm going to go against the popular opinion on this one and say that I wish it was a bit harder to settle Fury Bowser down. As it stands, he can be put back to sleep by collecting a cat shine, which led to a lot of scenarios in which I noticed that he was about to awaken just as I was about to grab a shine, so I just waited until he was fully awake and grabbed the shine immediately, putting him back to sleep. It's probably my fault for not fully engaging with the mechanic, but I feel like I don't fully deserve the blame for taking the very clear, very simple option to optimize some of the fun out of the system. Either way, the final battle against Fury Bowser was pretty simple but a lot of fun, and they do a great job of making you feel giant while it all plays out. All in all, Bowser's Fury is a very worthy addition to the 3D Mario series. Number 8. Outer Wilds, Mobius 2019. Outer Wilds is a sci-fi adventure game in which you play as an astronaut trapped in a 23-minute time loop trying to unravel the secrets of an ancient civilization in the hopes of finding a way to save your own. Quite frankly, this probably would have been higher on the list had I not played it just a few months after playing Heaven's Vault, which you will hear me talk about very shortly, since these two games have a pretty similar general premise, which meant that Heaven's Vault hit me with a feeling of uniqueness that Outer Wilds couldn't quite match. But Outer Wilds is still a very fun game. This is certainly one of the most technically impressive indie games I've ever seen. The planets in the game's star system orbit their sun based on formulas calculated in real time instead of being on rails. You can affect certain events like how Brittle Hollow falls apart that are determined procedurally rather than being scripted sequences, and a lot of attention is paid to how the mass of various bodies in the solar system affects their gravity. In terms of what you actually do in the game, exploration is pretty satisfying, as is the answer to the game's big overarching mystery, and I really like how clues to various puzzles are scattered throughout the world in a way that really encourages exploration, but also leaves no reason why you can't beat the game in a single loop if you know what you're doing. I've also heard that achievement hunting in this game is a lot more satisfying than in many others, but I haven't really done that myself. At the end of the day, this is a really solid game that I don't have much negative to say about. I just enjoyed some of the other games I played this year a bit more. Number 7. Nier Replicant version 1.22474487139. Toy Logic 2021. Remaster of Nier Replicant, Cavia 2010. Nier Replicant version 1.22, yes, I'm shortening it, you're welcome, is an action JRPG starring Nier, a young man who meets a magical talking book named Grimoire Weiss, who may hold the secret to curing a disease that afflicts Nier's sister and many of the other people around the world. I usually like to think of myself as someone who doesn't get carried away by overhyping games, but this game unfortunately turned out to be a reminder that I'm just as susceptible to that as anybody else. I've made no secret of my love for Nier Automata. It's one of my favorite games ever, and was the first game I Let's Played for this channel. So when this remake/remaster of the cult classic prequel was announced, featuring a combat system redesigned by Platinum Games designer Takahisa Taura, who was previously the senior game designer for Automata, as well as a notable designer on The Wonderful 101 and Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance, the latter of which I like even more than Automata, I was fully on board. Don't get me wrong, Nier Replicant version 1.22 is still a really good game, but there are a lot of issues holding it back from being a true masterpiece in my eyes. The overworld is split into a lot of disappointingly small sections separated by loading screens with extremely limited fast travel options to compensate. The vast majority of side quests aren't very fun, but since the game doesn't offer a very wide range of ways to make money, you're heavily incentivized to do at least a few. A lot of the boss fights are just a bit of a letdown, although they do continuously get better as the game progresses. The first half of the main story feels a little aimless, and you have to play through the second half at least 3 times in order to get every ending, which can get pretty tedious. Not to mention that there's one dungeon you have to visit at least 9 times to get every ending. Still, the combat is fast and exciting, the main characters are endearing despite being far from moral paragons, and the story is pretty interesting once it gets going. Automata is still the far superior game in my opinion, but if you're looking for a fun action RPG with a solid story, you can definitely do much worse than this. I think it's a real testament to this series' quality that I can call this game a bit of a letdown and still have it come in 7th place. Number 6. Heaven's Vault, Inkle 2019. Heaven's Vault is a puzzle-adventure game that sees you playing as an archaeologist named Aaliyah on a journey to unravel the mysterious history of the nebula she calls home. This is one of the weirdest games I've ever played, and I mean that in the absolute best way possible. The visual design, with the exception of a few choice NPC portraits, is absolutely stunning, and the general atmosphere of the game is fantastically developed. The settings are varied and interesting, as are all the people you get to talk to in order to learn more about the world. Honestly, my only problem with exploring and immersing myself in the world was that I sometimes wish I walked just a little bit faster. The centerpiece of the gameplay loop, though, is the language puzzles. See, many of the artifacts you find along your journey are engraved with an ancient writing system that you gradually decipher throughout the course of the game. In the game's early stages, you're guessing almost blindly, based on the vague context provided by what the words are engraved on, and what the shapes of the glyphs might relate to. Later on, you get longer strings of text, and match words you know to sections of that text, because this language apparently doesn't use spaces between words. And you start to figure out that certain sequences of glyphs represent certain more abstract concepts, and make guesses of new words based on that. For example, the word for goddess looks a lot like the word for holy, and so on. These minigames were very satisfying, and I was always looking forward to getting my hands on a new artifact to decipher. But ultimately, how much you decipher and what you figure out about the language doesn't really affect the overall plot that much, which was a bit disappointing. The ending, which I won't spoil here, was also a little weak in my opinion, but I understand what they were going for. Ultimately, if you're looking for a break from combat-focused games or just want a really unique gameplay experience, this is a game I can highly recommend. Number 5. Paper Mario: The Origami King, Intelligent Systems 2020. Paper Mario: The Origami King is an action-adventure game in which you play as Mario on a quest to save Princess Peach and the Toads of Toad Town from being folded into mind-controlled origami drones. I feel obligated to state that yes, this is the first Paper Mario game I've ever played, and yes, having never played the first 3 probably has a big impact on my opinion of this game, but dang it, this was just delightful. I really love the art style especially. The paper and craft materials were integrated into the environments really well, and so much of the game was so colorful and vibrant, and just a real joy to look at. The soundtrack was also fantastic, and the writing was really charming, with a bunch of humor that worked surprisingly well for me. I never expected to see a Franz Kafka reference in a Mario game, but here we are. I was worried going in that I would get tired of the combat system pretty quickly, but honestly, I found it fun and engaging for far longer than I expected to, and the game had the decency to end just when the combat was starting to feel a little bit stale. I do wish there were more encounters that used the altered combat system of the boss fights, as those were definitely my favorite fights in the game. I understand why a lot of people are disappointed with this series' refusal to return to what made it great in the first place, but so much of this game works so well for me that I can't help but appreciate it for what it is, in spite of the even greater game that it could have been. Number 4. The Great Ace Attorney Chronicles, Capcom 2021. Remasters of The Great Ace Attorney Adventures, Capcom 2015, and The Great Ace Attorney 2 Resolve, Capcom 2017. The Great Ace Attorney Chronicles is a puzzle game in which you play as rookie defense attorney Ryunosuke Naruhodo as he finds himself practicing law in Great Britain at the very end of the 19th century, aided by the inimitable detective Sherlock Sholmes. It's not every day that a previously Japanese exclusive game makes it over to North America for the first time, and as a fan of the Ace Attorney series, hoping that more than just another remaster of the Phoenix Wright trilogy would make it to modern consoles, this purchase was a no-brainer. I've decided to talk about both of this collection's games in one segment because there's virtually no gameplay difference between them, but the difference between the stories is night and day, and when your game is not that far from being a visual novel, the story is a pretty important thing to get right. Don't get me wrong, the story of the first game isn't bad, but the second game's plot stands head and shoulders over it, and even contends with some of the best plots the main series has to offer. On a smaller level, the individual murder mysteries are interesting and satisfying to unravel, even if the fourth case of the first game was just a little too absurd for my taste. From a gameplay standpoint, the typical gameplay loop is exactly what you would expect out of an Ace Attorney game, but there are various new features that are worthy additions to the series. I especially enjoyed the deduction and correction segments that Sholmes brought to the table. Replacing the usual sprites with 3D models also allowed the designer to do some new and interesting stuff with animations and camera work, which I definitely enjoyed. If this is a game you're interested in, be ready for a long ride. My first playthrough took me over 60 hours, but if you're okay with a lot of thinking and a lot of reading, this is a pretty fantastic experience. It even works as a pretty good entry point to the series if you've been interested in checking out Ace Attorney but haven't picked up the Phoenix Wright trilogy on any of the million systems it's been re-released on. Now, if we can please free Ace Attorney 4 through 6 from DS and mobile jail, that would be appreciated. Number 3. Metroid Dread, Mercury Steam 2021. Metroid Dread is a 2D Metroidvania, or action-adventure platformer for those who aren't as savvy with video game genre terminology, in which you play as legendary space bounty hunter Samus as she explores an uncharted planet with the aim of wiping out the last known instances of the deadly X-parasite in the wild. This was actually my first experience with a Metroidvania. I had been gradually convincing myself that I ought to try one throughout the course of 2021, and I was thinking of starting with an Ori game, but when Metroid Dread was announced, I decided that one of the series that gave the genre its name was as good a place as any to start. I was absolutely blown away, as you can probably tell by where this game is placed on the list. And I've already played it 10 or more times, although this is helped some by the game's length, which is just barely short enough to be a little bit disappointing, but not short enough to be a deal breaker. Possibly due to this length, the simple combat was enough to stay much more engaging than I expected through the course of the game. And even though I got very lost several times, the exploration was a joy as well. This game really lives up to its name as well. Dread is the perfect word to describe the feeling that I got whenever I was about to enter the areas patrolled by Emmys, nearly indestructible enemies that so much of the marketing was built around. All in all, this was a really stellar experience that I'm happy to say I enjoyed much more than I expected to. Number 2. Hitman III, IOI 2021. Hitman 3 is a stealth sandbox in which you play as the enigmatic assassin Agent 47 as he makes his final stand against Providence, a shadowy cabal of the rich and famous aiming for world domination. If you saw my equivalent video last year, you'll know that my opinion of the Hitman reboot series totally turned around when I played the second game in 2020, and I'm happy to say that the trilogy's third entry carries forward everything that made the first two games amazing. However, I did feel myself being just a little disappointed. Not necessarily with the game itself, but with the fact that it felt like this was the entry where the team really started to play around with how the series formula works, with only the first and fifth missions of the game really feeling like completely traditional Hitman reboot levels. Most of the ideas they introduced were really cool and interesting, but some felt like they could use a little bit more refining. This would not normally be that big of an issue, that's what sequels are for after all, but the fact that this is the third game in what has been marketed for a long time as a trilogy, combined with the fact that the developers are shifting their focus over to Project 007, their upcoming James Bond game, means that we're probably not going to see a sequel for quite a while. I'd like to illustrate this with a specific example of a mission in the mid-game, which I think is the worst offender, so if you're sensitive to premise and location spoilers, I'll give you a timestamp to skip to. For everyone else, the mission in Berlin, Germany sees you infiltrate a club crawling with other assassins who are this mission's targets. These assassins are all in disguises of their own, so you have to figure out who they are by sneaking around the area, trying to blend in with the crowd while keeping a careful eye out for anyone who doesn't, listening in on conversations, scoping out secluded areas in which kills might be possible, all the while avoiding detection from your targets. This felt like a really intense and fascinating mission premise, until the illusion was totally shattered by the fact that most of the assassins acted almost exactly like any other member of the NPC type they were disguised as. This feels like an idea that really needed another go, and once again, that's usually what sequels are for, but it looks like it will be a long time before this game gets one. There's one thing I want to make clear despite all these criticisms. Hitman 3 is still a Hitman reboot game, which means it's still really good. I can't speak for the rest of the series before the reboot, as I haven't actually played any of those games, but the Hitman games since 2016 have consistently been some of the best games I've played over the past 3 years, and I highly recommend giving the series a shot if you haven't already. Okay, side note from the future, I wrote that last segment several months ago before I even did my Hitman mission ranking video. By the way, that's a great way to see how I think this game stacks up with the rest of the series, and I'm pretty proud of that video, so I'll put a link in the description. And since then, the game released on Steam and got review bombed because, quite frankly, the team did not learn their lesson from the launch on the Epic Store. Yes, it sucks that the PC version was exclusive to the Epic Store for a year. Yes, it sucks that IOI botched the Epic Store release and then turned right around and botched the Steam release, but I hope that how much I've been praising this game makes it obvious just how good it is, that I can recommend it so highly despite all the issues around its release. And the recently announced Hitman 3 Year 2 makes it sound like the game is only going to continue to get better. Please go check this series out if you're even slightly interested. I promise it will absolutely be worth your time. I've decided to do something a little different with honorable mentions this year. Usually this segment would be devoted to games I played only part of in the year for one reason or another, so I'll go through a lightning round of those before I get to the juicy stuff. I played demos of Monster Hunter Rise, Project Triangle Strategy, Bravely Default 2, Sequence Storm, and Scarlet Nexus. Of those, I will definitely be playing the full version of Scarlet Nexus at some point, and I could see myself playing the full versions of Monster Hunter Rise and Sequence Storm, but they're not too high on my priority list for now. I started playing, but dropped, Friday Night Funkin', Doom 2016, Neo, Nier Reincarnation, and Crypt of the Necrodancer. I will also add to this list Somabringer, which I was originally planning to play more of during 2022, but which I decided to drop during the process of writing this script, which leaves the only game that I started in 2021 and intend to play more of in 2022 as Final Fantasy X HT, and if you've been following my channel recently, then you already know what's going on with that. With that out of the way, I'd like to take some time to talk about some of the other media that helped me survive 2021, because 2021 was very much a year I survived and not much else. First up, 2021 was the year that I really tried to get back into pleasure reading after doing barely any for most of my undergraduate years. And I read a lot of really good books. Black Hole Blues was very informative. The first two Stormlight Archive books have finally convinced me to get into high fantasy, and The Three Body Problem was just really freaking weird. But one book stands out above the rest for me, and that was American Gods by Neil Gaiman. It's set in a world in which every god humanity has ever imagined is real, and they subsist off people's belief in them. And that's just such a fantastic premise right off the bat. The plot pretty much only exists to give the characters an excuse to exist in this world, but the world is so interesting, the characters so solid, and the atmosphere so wonderfully woven that doesn't really matter to me. This was my first Neil Gaiman book, and I am very much looking forward to reading more. Also in 2021, I carried on my drive from 2020 to read more manga. I'm still reading One Piece on a weekly basis, and it's still probably my favorite work of fiction ever created, and I'm still considering in the back of my mind doing a pair of videos on it at some point in the future, but for right now, I want to talk about a different series that I started reading in 2021, A Silent Voice. If you've ever talked to me for more than, about 5 minutes, you'll know that the movie based on this manga is one of my absolute favorites, and I'm very happy to say that although I haven't read much of the manga yet, it is absolutely living up to the standard its adaptation set for me. In fact, the added context and additional scenes that the longer form storytelling are allowing for are sending me all the way across the emotional spectrum all over again. I understand that manga isn't for everybody, but if you're not willing to read it, please at least watch the movie if you haven't yet. They're both just so freaking good. Speaking of movies, I watched a few of them in 2021, and 12 Angry Men and Dances with Wolves have already become some all-time favorites for me. The former is one I saw a bit of in high school, but this was my first time seeing it all the way through, and it's still amazing to me that a feature-length movie pretty much entirely set in one location is so dang engrossing. But here it is. At barely over 90 minutes, it's a quick, snappy watch that's very heartfelt and very fun and very worth the time. Dances with Wolves, on the other hand, is a much bigger time investment, coming in at slightly under 4 hours, and the first hour or so was a bit too slow for my taste, but it's oh so worth it. Both of these movies are really fantastic, and I will definitely be coming back to both of them for another watch. If you saw my review of Doctor Who Flux, you'll know that I have been, let's say, less than satisfied with the Doctor Who that's been on TV for the past few years, which made this the perfect time for me to take the plunge into the weird and wonderful world of Doctor Who audio dramas. I spent most of the fall working my way through the first several 8th Doctor main range stories, and it's quite the story arc that I am very excited to listen to the rest of once I have the income to make purchasing it a less terrible idea. But the standout entry in the first set is easily The Chimes of Midnight. It's a murder mystery combined with a time loop where really weird stuff starts happening, and saying almost anything else would spoil an experience that a plot description alone can't do justice to. You'll want to listen to Storm Warning before you listen to this, but considering both stories are available on Spotify, they're well worth the $0 investment you'll be putting in. I also watched the anime Wonder Egg Priority, and it was bizarre, and delightful, and unsettling, and heart-wrenching, and sometimes really, really bad, but always really fascinating, and I won't go too much in depth on that, because I already have an entire video talking about it, but please also consider watching that video. It's another one that I'm really proud of, and didn't get quite as much attention as a lot of my other So I Just Watched videos, and also, maybe watch the series too. Like I say in that video, the ending may suck, but it also gave us some really, really fantastic television. With all that out of the way, let's talk about my favorite game I played in 2021, shall we? Number 1, Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition, Monolith Soft 2020. Remaster of Xenoblade Chronicles, Monolith Soft 2010. Let's be real here, was it ever going to be anything else? Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition is an action JRPG starring a young man named Shulk, whose quest to avenge the death of one of his best friends and the near destruction of his hometown leads him on a journey across one of the most inventive fictional worlds I've ever seen, and lands him in the middle of events much stranger and much more significant than he ever anticipated. Let's get it out of the way right at the start that this remaster does in a lot of ways look like a new coat of paint over an old game, but quite frankly, I don't care. The original game was already a stunning achievement for a Wii exclusive, and despite a few graphical shortcomings here and there in this remaster, I still found myself pausing on several occasions because of how in awe I was over just how beautiful this game looks. Besides, the models of the human characters, which were, in my opinion, the biggest graphical shortcoming of the original, have been pretty much completely overhauled, and despite the complaints I've seen about the more anime look, I think the new designs are going to age significantly better than the old ones. As for the combat system, it's certainly one of the more unique ones I've seen, and while it is fairly easy to pick up and suitably entertaining for a good 40 hours or so, I do think it falls a little bit short of the depth necessary to keep it feeling fresh and engaging for 65, which is probably what a casual first-time playthrough is going to be closer to. That's not to say I was bored for the last 25 hours, just that I didn't find myself changing up my approach much once I got my last party member. But it would be almost criminal not to mention the story. The first experience I had with the original, after all, was Chugga Conroy's Let's Play series, so the story was what made me really fall in love with the game. It has one of, quite possibly the best story I've ever seen in a video game. The characters are endearing and interesting, although the writing doesn't do a great job of making sure every main party member stays an active agent in the plot in the late game. That's easy to ignore, as the story's endgame starts layering on boatloads of twists and turns that straddle the line between shocking and satisfyingly built up near perfectly. The whole story is bolstered by easily one of my favorite video game soundtracks, which not only has a number of songs that I would and do listen to on their own. This music sets an emotional tone closer to perfect than almost any other I've heard, both in the story and in the gameplay. Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition is one of those games that makes me say to myself, there's never been a game like this before, in the very best way. An experience that is becoming vanishingly rare the more games I play. New to this version of the game is Xenoblade Chronicles Future Connected, a playable epilogue that will give you a good 10 to 15 hours of new content set almost entirely in a brand new location, which nerds way too invested in this series will tell you is actually heavily based on an area that was very nearly included in the original game, but ended up getting cut late in development. Neither the story nor the gameplay of Future Connected quite managed to live up to the main game, but that is an absurdly high bar, and Future Connected is still quite a lot of fun in its own right, and incorporates a few ideas that I do hope get carried into future Xenoblade Chronicles games. All in all, I genuinely believe that even a decade or two from now, Xenoblade Chronicles will still be mentioned in the same breath as the likes of Chrono Trigger, Final Fantasy VII, and Earthbound as one of the greatest JRPGs ever made. So if you are at all a fan of the genre and haven't played this game yet, please give it a try. There has never been a better time to get into Xenoblade, and I highly, highly doubt that you will be disappointed. Well, that's about all I wanted to talk about as far as games I played for the first time this year. I talked a little bit in the intro about why I chose to go back to the ranked list format as opposed to the tier list I used last year, but I'm curious to know which format you guys prefer. So if you happen to like one over the other and are willing to share why, I'd love to hear about it in a comment. Speaking of the future of this series, my backlog is currently packed full of games I've never played but I'm really excited to try out, like the Zero Escape Collection, No More Heroes, which I actually did wind up playing between writing the script and recording the audio, The Witcher 3, and Alien Isolation. And of course, I'm very excited for Bayonetta 3, Breath of the Wild 2, and especially Xenoblade 3. So I'm sure I'll have a lot of thoughts to share with you this time next year. Until then, I've been Brainy Diode, and for all our sakes, I hope good video games aren't the only thing we have to look forward to in 2022. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon.